He was just 12 when it all began. Now, at only 15, Christopher Atkins has been sentenced to 40 years in prison. A teenager who can't even drive, vote, or fully grasp the weight of his decisions will now spend most of his life locked behind bars. This isn't a headline from a crime drama or a scripted series. It's a real story out of Marion County, Florida. But what could possibly warrant such a sentence? The answer lies in a case so disturbing, it shattered a community. Over the span of just a few days, 3 teenagers were murdered. One girl was found in a ditch, another left on the roadside, and a third discovered in the trunk of a car submerged in water. At first, the community panicked, but when the truth surfaced, it was even more shocking. The victims and suspects weren't strangers. They knew each other and they were friends. And at the center of it all was Christopher, the youngest, the one no one expected. So how does someone so young end up involved in something so violent, so irreversible? What really happened in those final hours before everything fell apart? And why did the court decide that 40 years was the only answer? In this video, we're going back to the crime, the people involved, the turning point, and the trial that shocked the nation. Because once you hear how it all unfolded, you'll be left wondering how a kid became part of one of Florida's darkest cases. Before we talk about what happened and who was responsible, we need to understand who was lost. Because behind the crime scene tape and courtroom headlines were 3 teenagers whose lives had only just begun. Layla Silvernail was just 16 years old. She was a rising softball star, known for her talent, determination, and her warm personality that made her a natural leader both on and off the field. She had big dreams, college, a future in sports, and a life full of possibilities. That future was taken from her. Then there was Michael Hodo Jr., 17. Quiet, thoughtful, and trying to make better choices, he had recently started distancing himself from negative influences. He had plans to turn things around, but he never got that chance. Camille Quarles, also 16, was described by friends as full of energy and laughter. She had her own goals and a personality that made her stand out. What happened to her was especially haunting. Found locked in the trunk of a submerged car. 3 young people, connected by friendship and trust, found themselves caught in something they never saw coming. They weren't strangers to their killers. That's what makes this case so painful. These weren't random attacks, they were betrayals. And while it's easy to focus on the shocking age of the suspects, it's the victims' stories that deserve to be remembered first. They had plans for the weekend, people who loved them, and lives they should still be living. What led to their deaths was more than just violence. It was personal. It all unfolded in the span of just a few days in late March 2023, 3 lives lost, one after another. The timeline began when Layla Silvernail was reported missing. Hours later, her body was discovered near a dumpster along the side of the road. She had been shot. The community was shaken, but no one imagined what would follow. The next day, a second victim, Michael Hodo Jr., was found by the roadside, also dead from gunshot wounds. At this point, investigators knew something far more sinister was happening. Then came the most haunting discovery. Police found Layla's car partially submerged in a Marion County pond. When they pulled it out, they found the third victim, Camille Quarles, lifeless in the trunk. All 3 teens were killed within a short window, and the scenes appeared connected by more than just coincidence. What investigators would soon uncover is that all 3 victims had ties to the suspects. They weren't random targets. This was personal. According to police reports, the group, including Christopher Atkins, Taj Bruton, and Robert Robinson, had planned to rob the victims. But somewhere along the way, that plan turned into murder. No one knows exactly what triggered the violence, whether it was fear of getting caught, a conflict within the group, or something even deeper. But the killings were carried out in cold blood, and efforts were made to hide the bodies. The calmness with which it was executed shocked even seasoned detectives. These weren't adults with long criminal histories. They were teenagers, and in Atkins' case, barely out of childhood. What happened in those few days turned a quiet Florida town into the center of a national nightmare. And the question that still lingers is, why didn't anyone see it coming? As the bodies were discovered one by one, panic quickly spread through Marion County. 3 teens murdered in just 3 days. It didn't feel random. At first, the sheriff's office wasn't even sure if the cases were connected. But the timing, the proximity, and the similarities in how each victim was found began painting a grim picture. Rumors flew. Some feared a serial killer was targeting young people. Others wondered if gangs were involved. But behind the scenes, investigators were quietly piecing together evidence, surveillance footage, digital data, witness tips. It didn't take long before the focus shifted inward, toward people the victims actually knew. The real shock came when names started emerging. Not adults, not strangers, but teenagers. And then came the most jarring discovery. One of the suspects was just 12 years old, Christopher Atkins. He was arrested shortly after the third body was found. The community was stunned. A child, barely out of elementary school, was now facing accusations of being involved in a triple homicide. Alongside him, police arrested Robert Robinson and later caught up with Taj Bruton, who had briefly gone on the run. All three were taken into custody. All three were charged with first-degree murder. But what stunned everyone wasn't just who did it, it was how close they had all once been. Friends turned killers, teens turned suspects, and now, a small Florida town was left reeling from a truth that was even harder to accept than the crimes themselves. As the case moved forward, it became clear that not all three suspects played the same role in the murders. Christopher Atkins stood out, not just because of his age, but because of how quickly he cooperated with investigators. At 12 years old, when the crimes happened, he wasn't seen as the mastermind. According to court records, it was Taj Bruton who pushed for the robbery that led to the shootings. Christopher's involvement was different. While his exact actions during the killings remain complicated, he was accused of helping during the planning stages and of being present when at least one of the victims was murdered. He was also charged with helping cover up what happened, including tampering with evidence after the fact. When given the chance to take a plea deal, Christopher agreed. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges: first-degree murder in the death of Camille Quarles, armed robbery, tampering with evidence, and battery of a law enforcement officer while in custody. In return, prosecutors dropped the death penalty from the table, though due to his age, that was never a real option, and guaranteed that his sentence would be capped below life. The deal also required Christopher to testify against the others if needed. For many, his plea sparked debate. Was he a child manipulated by older teens? Or did he understand exactly what he was doing? Either way, the system had made its decision, and Christopher was no longer just a suspect. He was a convicted murderer. While Christopher Atkins accepted a plea deal early on, the other two defendants, Taj Bruton and Robert Robinson, chose a different path. Both were older, 17 at the time of the murders, and both eventually entered no-contest pleas to multiple charges, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and evidence tampering. Their trials never went before a jury, but the courtroom still heard the full weight of what had happened. During sentencing hearings, victims' family members delivered emotional impact statements. Parents and grandparents stood in front of the judge and spoke directly to the boys who had taken their children. Layla Silvernail's grandmother said she still wakes up hearing her granddaughter's voice. Camille Quarles' family described the pain of not even knowing where she was until her body was found in the trunk of a car. In the end, the judge handed down some of the harshest sentences possible. Taj Bruton received 3 life sentences, plus additional time for related charges. Robert Robinson was given 5 life terms. Both will be eligible for a sentence review after 25 years, but the message was clear. The court saw them as the primary drivers of the violence. Their decisions had not only ended 3 young lives, but also set off a ripple effect of grief and destruction that couldn't be undone. Unlike Christopher, they showed little cooperation early on, and the justice system responded with the full weight of accountability. On July 22, 2025, Christopher Atkins stood before a judge to learn his fate. At just 15 years old, he was about to be sentenced for his role in a triple homicide that had shaken the entire county. The courtroom was heavy with emotion. Defense attorneys reminded the judge that Christopher was only 12 at the time of the crimes, still a child, lacking full understanding of the consequences. They pointed to his cooperation, his guilty plea, and his willingness to testify against the older teens. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They argued that no matter how young he was, the decisions he made had deadly results. He helped plan the robbery. He was present during the violence. And afterward, he didn't run to the police. He helped cover it up. The judge acknowledged all sides, but ultimately, the decision reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Christopher was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 798 days of time already served. He'll be eligible for a sentence review after 25 years, meaning he could still be a relatively young man if granted early release. But for now, his reality is clear. The next 4 decades will be spent behind bars. The courtroom remained quiet as the sentence was read. Some cried. Others just sat in stunned silence. A child had been held accountable for a crime that most people still struggle to comprehend, and the justice system had delivered its final word. When we think about violent crime, we often picture hardened adults, long histories of trouble, and years of bad choices piling up. But this case shattered that idea. Here, we saw kids, barely teenagers, involved in something no one could explain or make sense of. 3 young lives were lost in the span of just a few days, and 3 others, including the youngest, Christopher Atkins, will now spend decades behind bars. It raises questions that have no easy answers. How does someone so young even get pulled into something this dark? Could anyone have seen it coming? Was this a failure of the justice system, of parenting, of community? Or was it just one terrible choice that spiraled out of control? In the end, everyone lost, the victims, their families, even the perpetrators. And for those left behind, the pain doesn't fade. It becomes part of their lives. This case isn't just a headline. It's a warning about how quickly things can fall apart, about how even kids can make decisions with life-altering consequences, and about how justice isn't always black and white, especially when children are involved. This was the story of Christopher Atkins, a 12-year-old who became part of a triple homicide, and a 15-year-old who now faces 40 years in prison. You've been watching Crime Shade, where we follow the truth, no matter how dark the path may be.